Hey, dear Professor Corrales. Continuing with the third part of the interview on the subject of sustainable development in the context of the subject, research and sustainability, we continue with the interview. In the second part, we closed by talking about the role of the educator and the university student of the Venezuelan citizen in creating and contributing to the creation of a new style of development. We were not talking about the situation in Venezuela in the second part, and in this last part, we are going to address what are the problems that we need to give more importance to in order to work on them and find solutions so that Venezuela can be included in the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Objectives. And what are the strategies to reorient Venezuela's development? Well, look, the axis, the fundamental axis of the strategy, should keep in mind what any political leader or leader of civil society who is interested in Venezuela recovering. The fundamental axis is to change the style of development. The development style, as I was saying, is a general way of functioning of society. It is not only the way in which the state functions. It is the way in which we citizens function. It is the culture of the public that we share. It is an imaginary in which roles have been reversed and a leading role is given to the state and a submissive or secondary role to the individual. Okay, with that as a framework, keeping in mind what we have to do is change the development style. There is an assuming the let's say structure of thought of sustainable human development. I would say that there are three fundamental strategies that address precisely the three major areas that we talked about in the first interview that you did with me. The first major strategy is a capacity building strategy. There you have EH. Well, the second is a strategy, I would say, of recomposition of the social fabric, and the third is a strategy of institutional reform. The three are closely associated. You cannot say that they are three separate drawers of a desk. Let's start with the strategy of capacity building, the fundamental thing in the capacity building strategy. There are two fundamental pillars of this strategy, which are a quality education that is accessible to all Venezuelan society. All members of Venezuelan society throughout their lives. Education is not one, it is not training to work. Especially in the last 40 years. Even to be able to keep up to date and have skills to work. Continuous education is needed, because I have to learn about technology. For example, so the first pillar is a quality education accessible to all Venezuelans throughout their lives. But fundamentally because for what to do, that we have, structural poverty is above 70%. Although we have reached income poverty of around 80%, 90%. Let's say that if the economic situation in Venezuela were to improve at this time, we would still have a poverty level of no less than 68%. For that to disappear, a lot of time is needed. At least 15 years of a very high level of education are needed. Open to the children of all Venezuelan homes so that the incorporation of new people into the workforce will gradually remove people from the workforce who failed to develop those skills. Education. Quality. Up above, and I will talk later apart from university education and the national science and technology system. The second, health and social security system. Quality. In Venezuela, the social security system that was created in the 40s of the last century has gone bankrupt like 5 times. That is, the savings of the workers were squandered at least 5 times, and today there is practically no social assistance. The workers do not. The old people, the people who retire, do not have a decent pension to live on. But those who have not retired for reasons of age but for reasons of health, for example, do not have them either, and in general the Venezuelan middle class and working class family health service that quality to that can be accessed with the income that your home has. Then that is the second pillar, a health system, and along with it, I am not going to point it out as a third pillar, but rather as the second pillar, the system. The health system has to actually extend care. It is a social security system that includes health, but that also includes the pension system, etc. The third great pillar is the national system of science, technology, and innovation, increasingly in the world, especially in a race that has been going on since the 70s of the last century. Increasingly in the world, what promotes progress is technological innovation. It is the application of scientific knowledge to production, to services, education, etc., and therefore, the countries or societies that have an integrated system with a network, let's say, of research, development, and higher education are the countries that have taken the lead and that are increasingly separating themselves from countries with high development and that have a high development and that are increasingly separating themselves from countries with, as Venezuela, which had just begun to sow a system of science, technology, and innovation, and the populist government that came to power in 1998 destroyed it. That is the third pillar. So the creation, the strategy of capacity building has those pillars. The second strategy that I mentioned to you has to do with the reconstruction of the social fabric. Social fabric, EH, refers to or suggests cohesion. The cohesion of the professor. Professor, vision of the future of our country, and that is both due to the growth of poverty and social exclusion from the 1980s onwards, as well as the arrival and very voluntary strategy of dividing, of confronting society, of polarizing it. Due to those two things, Professor, listen to me, Professor. Professor, you are there. Professor, Professor, appear. I don't know. It was cut off, it was cut off, it appeared again. I don't know where I got to. I was saying about the strategy. Well, you know how to edit these things. well, no, it doesn't matter. We'll leave this like this, you were talking about the reconstruction of the social fabric. Yes, well, I was saying the third strategy. Sorry, the second strategy is a strategy for the reconstruction of the social fabric. The social fabric is supported by the imaginary. That is, by the shared values, by the shared vision of the country's future, by the motivation to cooperate, and Venezuela lost all that. It lost it on the one hand. It began to lose it since the 80s of the last century with the deterioration of the quality of life of the majority of the population that we had. We went from having 4 million poor people to having 16 million poor people between 1978 and 1998. That is the first reason for the destruction of the social fabric or for the weakening of the imaginary. But the second reason is that there was a voluntary, programmed strategy of the political group that came to power in 1999 to polarize society, to divide society between the suffering people and the elites that exploit them and have kept them isolated or have kept them without access to the benefits of development. It must be rebuilt, because if not, if Venezuelans are not willing to cooperate, we will not be able to build the capacities of society as a whole. But in addition, we will always be close to a political rupture, to the destruction of society itself, which is a bit like what has been happening to us or what we have been feeling in the last 25 years. The reconstruction of the social fabric. A strategy for rebuilding the social fabric, I believe. I think it has two things or two major components. One is all the efforts to overcome poverty, which have on the one hand what I told you in a previous answer. We must attend to the people who are living in variety, but the fundamental thing is the creation of capacities to eliminate poverty. To say have a horizon of 20 years and in that horizon achieve reducing poverty to less than 10%. That is a first component, but the other component is reconciliation. Yes, the change that at least I hope for in the coming years. In the coming months. If this change sets in motion a whole witch hunt program, Venezuela will not be reconciled and will not be able to get out of the situation we are in. When I speak of reconciliation, I am not talking about reconciliation with the criminals. The criminals. That is why there is justice, although there are certainly some forms of justice that if we have time we can talk about, which is what has been called transitional justice. I am talking about a reconciliation at the grassroots. The grassroots of the Venezuelan population were deceived. First, they share a cultural problem, which is the myths of the creation of Venezuela, around the great leaders. The horseman that was talked about in the 19th century and in the 20th century, that has not been lost. That has been a legacy of the Venezuelan people forever and only through education. And education then has a very important role in reconciliation. Only through that way, through formal education and through informal education is it possible to make the myth of the horseman, the myth of that charismatic leader who is going to save me from that messianic leader disappear from the Venezuelan imagination, and that the citizen understands his value. His own value and his capacity to contribute to the reconstruction of that new society with a style of inclusive development. That is what I understand. Effectively, there is, let's say that to put it in very simple terms. A strategy for rebuilding the social fabric has a material component. We must get out of poverty, and we already talked about all those policies, and it has a cultural component. If you want spiritual, which is that it is that in which formal education and informal education have a very important role, and as informal education. Imagine the cooperation, civil society, the middle class, actively cooperating. That is, launching initiatives for social cooperation with popular groups, with popular homes. That is the main means of informal education to overcome the polarization into which we have fallen for the last 25 years. That is the strategy. So Professor, listening to you, in fact Professor, I can see at this moment that Venezuelan society has generated a series of commitments to survive in the midst of a totally destroyed country, it is generating that kind of systemic organization through civil society organizations that have been growing in these last 7 years, and that has allowed to generate a little bit of that autonomy to create what I need to build the life that I have reasons to value, even if it is to a small extent. And I believe that that is an important root. When you named me, I believe that effectively. Look, the civil society organizations. Those of the middle class, which are the majority. The civil society organizations have a very important role in changing the imaginary for what you said. That what you are telling me for the exercise of my freedom and my autonomy. So that in the culture that Venezuelans share. That is fundamental, but there is one more thing, and it is the solidarity cooperation. That I do not have distrust of the man or of the middle-class family. Because he sees me as less, and when he gives me something he gives it to me because seeing it as a handout. That I do not have that distrust, that I feel that we can effectively cooperate. There is a role above all of the civil society organizations that have dedicated themselves to the defense of human rights of civil society organizations that have humanitarian and educational purposes also have an important role to play. But look, educators again and young people have a very important role because they do not only teach classes. Educators are not only teachers or professors. They have a leadership in their communities that they can exercise. And as they are knowledgeable about the way in which knowledge and culture are shared. Not in the traditional way as it is taught, in the way in which knowledge and culture are shared, as they are knowledgeable about that. They can add a lot to civil society organizations directed at cooperation. Solidarity cooperation, cooperation that is not felt as a gift or alms, and, in short, that, let's say that we will not dwell on the strategy of. In fact, I see very clearly that path. The path of building through civil society organizations. Through universities. Through educational institutions, also private education. Despite what has diminished as a result of all the social problems. Private education will continue to contribute to the reconstruction of that fabric. Social that will allow us to have that cohesion, professor. Then and well, and obviously the third strategy is that of the reform of institutional reform. Let's say that it is the one that will build with that strategy we are going to try to build the structure of the new building of Venezuelan development. The beams and the columns, and because the rules for the amiento once they are institutionalized, they say a lot are open. Or close doors for opportunities for improvement or for vices such as those that have been installed in Venezuela over many years. The first objective of the institutional reform strategy is to achieve that the state is at the service of the citizen and not the other way around. Like that, and with that, inspired by that. There are reforms that come down from the Constitution, in which, for example, the state is not given the monopoly of any sector of the economy. Yes, and the Venezuelan is made to feel from childhood that in reality he is the center of development. That he is the subject and the end and not an instrument. State. I think that this is the most important point that needs to be addressed in order to understand the true role of the state and to get away from the rentier model that you talked about. From the rentier style, forgive me for correcting you. From the rentier style, yes, well, and from there are reforms. For example, in the economy, in each of the reforms, reforms of the economy, the leading role, the role of entrepreneur, must be denied to the state. What the state must do as guarantor of the rights of society is to establish a regulatory system that leaves in a transparent, very clear way how far the exercise of an entrepreneur can go without harming the rights of a worker. For example, exactly, but also very clear, how far the regulation itself can go without harming the right, the autonomy that the entrepreneur has, the rights. Economic rights have to be completely redesigned. From what I see, Professor, institutional reconstruction. Institutional reconstruction is going to be a long job, just like the recovery of capacities, and in fact we are going to need professionals in all areas. We are going to need economists, lawyers, we are going to need all kinds of professionals for the reconstruction of institutions. Well, but let me give you a few additional ideas about institutional reform. Because institutional reform has to affect everything we talked about before in relation to, for example, the strategy of capacity building and the strategy of repairing the social fabric. We have to redesign the Venezuelan educational system. That belongs to institutional reform. National, for example, public education, which the Venezuelan state has been theoretically obliged to since the 19th century. That responsibility can only be assumed through the public employee teacher and the schools subject to any kind of political manipulation by the parties. Or the state can take on the operation of a free public education system. At a very low cost but of quality, it can take it on. For example, by supporting initiatives for example of teachers' cooperatives or initiatives of educational networks as is the case of FE. Alegrias, which we should try to multiply, that is a very important institutional reform. The obligation of the state to guarantee access to quality education for all children and young people and, I would add, for all adults at any time in their lives, does not necessarily have to be fulfilled through the traditional scheme that we have had. And there are experiences in many countries that demonstrate ways to do so. One of those countries is Switzerland, where there is public education by schools that operate by cooperatives. But Chile itself has had enormous success in the last 30 years, and it is not a Pinochet success. Let's be clear. Because there has been a deformation or a manipulation of information with which they try to discredit, for example, the educational model of Chilean public education by saying that those are Pinochet's reforms. No sir, those are reforms that come from the 90s when democracy returned to Chile and onwards, and it was a shared construction of the country. That's right, well, so you have the reform of the health system and the social security system. Well, the reform. I'm going to leave a very delicate one for last, which is the reform of the armed forces. Yes, we don't have much time left, Professor. In order to continue, then we cannot talk about the reform of the armed forces. There is a reform, we have little time left. There is a very important reform, a very important institutional reform, which is that of Venezuela's relations with the rest of the world. Venezuela has to open itself up effectively in an autonomous manner, not in a manner subject to the will of other countries. It has to open itself up to a healthy relationship. The world has, for example, to promote international trade, not to close borders to imports. but rather to open them up to the technology that will allow it to compete with exports. But there must also be the possibility for Venezuela to leverage itself in developing countries that have progressed. That are countries with those who we were far above in the 80s and who today we are far below. Because they assumed a relationship with the rest of the world, a constructive relationship. The reform of Venezuela's international relations is fundamental. I'll give just one example. It's an example that affects me personally. Being an ambassador of Venezuela, and in an international negotiation, cooperation and development approached me. Economic. Proposing that we try to move Venezuela's incorporation into this organization that is the OECD. Until then, I'm talking about the 90s. Until then, the OECD was made up only of developed countries. Venezuela began, that is, there were, let's say, ears and willingness to do it, and Venezuela began to move towards preparation to become a member of the OECD. Becoming a member of the OECD implied complying with a series of requirements, among which were economic freedoms, for example, it began to be. And the change of government came in 1998 and all that. Have had. Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico, Colombia. Having joined that organization, the OECD, since those times. Well, let's say that, let's conclude there. The best thing is that if you invite me some other time we can talk about the reform of the armed forces, which is also an important reform. Subject part of which is also part of the reconstruction of the country. Professor, I want to thank you infinitely for all your contributions. I am sure that these ideas will fill with clarity these future professionals who are being trained to contribute to the reconstruction of the social fabric in Venezuela and to be able to contribute to Venezuela being inserted again on a path of development. Thank you very much, Professor, and well, I will continue inviting you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you. Greetings, good Antonio Nieto.